Hello, I'm Tom Rollins, president of the Teaching Company. These lectures are part of the Great Courses on Tape series. The Great Courses on Tape cover a broad array of university-level disciplines. The lectures in each course are either 30 or 45 minutes long. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalog or website and imagine how much you could learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the best college classrooms in the world. The lecturers are university professors carefully selected by the Teaching Company and its customers for intellectual distinction and teaching excellence. The lectures on these tapes are titled The Aeneid of Virgil. The lecturer is Professor Elizabeth Vandiver. Professor Vandiver teaches Homer and other Greek and Roman authors at Northwestern University. After receiving her MA and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, she held visiting professorships at the University of Georgia, the Intercollegiate Center for Classical Studies in Rome, Loyola University of New Orleans, and Utah State. Professor Vandiver has written several articles and is the author of Heroes in Herodotus, The Interaction of Myth and History. She has also delivered numerous papers at national and international conferences. In 1998, Dr. Vandiver received the American Philological Association's Excellence in Teaching Award, the most prestigious teaching award available to American classical scholars. She also won the Northwestern University Department of Classics Excellence in Teaching Award for 1998 and the University of Georgia's Outstanding Honors Professor Award in 1993 and 1994. Each of Dr. Vandiver's lectures is outlined in the course guide that comes with these tapes. The course guide also includes a glossary, timeline, biographical notes, and bibliography. You might find it useful to review the outlines before and after listening to the lectures. Lecture 1, Introduction.
Hello, and welcome to this introductory lecture in the course on the Aeneid of Virgil. My name is Elizabeth Vandiver. I teach classics, that's Latin and Greek, language, literature, history, and culture at Northwestern University. And for the next few hours, I'll be talking to you about one of the greatest works of Roman antiquity, the Aeneid of Virgil. In this first lecture, I want to do three main things. I want to discuss what the Aeneid is and why it's still worth reading some 2,000 years after it was written. Second, I want to briefly outline and explain the approach that the course is going to take, what I'm trying to do in these lectures. And then third, I want to give you a brief overview of Roman culture's relationship to Greek culture, from which Rome borrowed a great deal in art, literature, and even religion. And the lecture will close by discussing the Romans' attitudes towards Greek culture, from which they borrowed so much. So, to begin with, what is the Aeneid? Well, first and foremost, the Aeneid is the great national epic of ancient Rome, and because of Rome's influence on later Western culture, the Aeneid is also one of the primary works of literature in the Western tradition. Within Roman tradition itself, within Roman culture itself, the Aeneid provided a foundation myth for the Romans. By a foundation myth, I mean a story about how the Roman people came into existence, how Rome came to be, and why it came to be so great. The Aeneid does this by providing a link between Roman culture and the great mythic stories of the earlier Greek culture, specifically the story of the Trojan War. In the Aeneid, Virgil links Rome's history with the myths of Greece by telling us how Aeneas, a minor member of the Trojan royal family, escaped from Troy at the end of the Trojan War, made his way westward, eventually came to Italy, and founded a new people there in Italy. So Aeneas is a Trojan, but he's also the ancestor of the Roman people. By forming this link between Greek mythic history and Rome's actual history, the Aeneid is, in fact, a sort of epitome for what Roman culture did in general, borrow and adapt Greek models to provide background for its own culture, as I'll talk about later on in this lecture. The Aeneid, once it was written, or once it was published after Virgil's death in 19 BC, the Aeneid quickly became one of the foremost literary texts of Rome. In fact, it became one of the texts that was focused on in the Roman education from its creation really up to the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. The Aeneid, along with the plays of Terence, the rhetorical works of Cicero, and the history of Sallust, was one of the four primary literary texts that Roman schoolchildren studied. So it had enormous influence within Roman culture itself. And because of Rome's incalculable influence on later Western European civilization, the Aeneid served as a model for a great deal of later literature and as an inspiration for art, for music, for all sorts of later cultural developments. The most obvious influence, I suppose, that the Aeneid had was on Dante's Divine Comedy, where, of course, Virgil appears as a character in that later epic. During late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, Greek was not studied in Western Europe. The Roman Empire divided into the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire is often also called Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire. And during late antiquity and the Middle Ages, there was a great division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and Greek was forgotten in Western Europe. Greek literature, Greek language, Greek culture were not studied. What this means is that the Aeneid became the primary source during these centuries of the Middle Ages for the Trojan War myth, that myth that is one of the most important and pervasive myths of Greek, Roman, and later Western civilization, was known in the Middle Ages primarily through Virgil's description of it in the Aeneid. This is part of why the Aeneid's influence on later literature and culture is so enormous, because for many centuries it was really the main source of information on the Trojan War and the sack of Troy. Even once Greek literature was rediscovered in Western Europe in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, even then, the Aeneid, as it happens, gives the fullest surviving account that we have of some of the most important events in the Trojan War story. For instance, the story of the sack of Troy, of how Troy actually fell at the hands of the Greeks, the story of the Trojan horse, the famous device by which the Greeks got entrance into the city of Troy. Those events are described far more fully in the Aeneid than they are in any other work of ancient literature that has survived to the present day. So while we now also have access to Greek literature telling about the Trojan War, such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, some of the great tragedies and so forth, still the Aeneid is very important for us because it gives the fullest account of the destruction of Troy and of the ruse of the Trojan horse. So one thing that the Aeneid does, obviously, for its original audience and for us today, is to provide a great deal of information about the Trojan War and to detail Aeneas's adventures after he escapes from Troy and makes his way to Italy. However, the Aeneid is much more than just an adventure story. It's much more than just a story about Aeneas's wanderings or even a story about the Trojan War and its aftermath. The Aeneid is also an examination of leadership, of conflicting duties and desires, particularly the conflict that a leader faces between his private desires and his public duties, and in short, the relationship of the individual to society. So the Aeneid addresses some extremely far-reaching and important issues about society and the role of the individual in society, and that, of course, is part of what makes it remain so compelling even today. Now, what I want to do in these lectures is to concentrate on careful and detailed examination of the Aeneid's background, of some of its main themes, and of some of its most significant episodes. Clearly, in 6 hours, I cannot talk about every episode in the epic, or even every important episode in the epic. But what I can do, what I will attempt to do at least, is touch on the highlights of the Aeneid, on some of the scenes that bring out these wider thematic issues about the individual and society, about leadership and other such. And so, in order to do this, these lectures will approach the Aeneid really from 3 angles. First of all, most of my lectures will include a synopsis of the plot of the relevant section of the Aeneid. The essential readings for each lecture will be taken from the Aeneid itself, so that by the time we get to the end of the course, students who have done the essential readings will have read the entire Aeneid. But I realize that it's not always possible to do the readings before you listen to the lecture. Some of you may be listening to these lectures in your car on the way to and from work, for instance. So I'll try to give enough synopsis of the plot line in each section of the Aeneid that I'm discussing that you can follow what I'm talking about, even if you haven't yet had a chance to read the relevant section of the Aeneid. Along with some plot summary, I'll also, when necessary, discuss the cultural background and the cultural assumptions of the specific scenes under discussion. That is, when I think that modern cultural assumptions about, say, the relationship between the sexes can give a distorted view of what's going on in the Aeneid, I'll talk about the background of Virgil and his contemporaries to try to get some insight into what he was probably doing with the scenes under discussion. And finally, the lectures will examine the larger issues with which the Aeneid concerns itself, the deeper content, if you like, of which plot and cultural assumptions are the vehicle, those wider thematic issues that I've already mentioned. But before we begin our reading of the Aeneid itself, I need to cover really three different types of background information in this lecture and in the next two lectures. We need to talk about the cultural background, which is what I'll do in the remainder of this lecture, the relationship of Roman culture and Greek culture specifically. We need to talk about the mythological and literary background for the Aeneid, where Virgil got the plot that he uses, where he modeled his work on, what kind of literature he was referring back to, and we'll look at that in the second lecture. And then finally, the third kind of introductory material that we need to cover is the historical background. It's something of a commonplace or a truism to say that any work of literature can only be fully appreciated if one knows something about the culture for which and in which it was written. But I think this is perhaps more true of the Aeneid than it is even of most works of literature, and that's why I'm planning to spend a significant amount of time on filling in background for you, so that when we actually turn to discussing the Aeneid itself in Lecture 4, you'll be equipped to appreciate it fully. So in this lecture, the background information I want to cover is the relationship of Roman culture to Greek culture, and particularly how and why the Romans adopted and adapted Greek cultural models for their own. Now, the relationship between Greek and Roman culture is extremely complicated, and I can do no more than sketch out the barest outline here. But to begin with, it's important to bear in mind the relative dates of these two cultures. We have a tendency that's been around for many, many centuries, to talk about the ancient Greeks and Romans as though they were all one thing, one homogeneous mass. In fact, they were two cultures that were separate and in many ways quite different. Greeks, of course, in Greece and its surrounding areas, the Romans in Italy and its surrounding areas. However, there is a relationship between the two cultures. There is a reason why they are lumped together in a way that, say, the ancient Greeks and Egyptians are not, or the ancient Romans and Hebrews are not. And that very complex relationship between the two cultures is what I want to explore here. First of all, the relative dates of the two cultures. Greece comes first. According to tradition, Rome was founded in 753 BC. In the 8th century BC. By that time, many of the most important Greek city-states were already ancient. They had been around for many, many centuries at the date of Rome's foundation, when Rome first came into being. And many of these Greek city-states were recognized centers of power when Rome was just first beginning to flex its political muscles in the Mediterranean. Athens, for instance, the most important of the Greek city-states, the one about which we know the most, the one that has left us the most in the way of literature, artwork, and Athens reached its zenith during the 5th century BC, the 400s BC. And that's the time period that most people have in mind when they think about the art, architecture, literature, and so forth of classical Greece. It was in the 5th century in Athens that the Parthenon was built on the Acropolis, that Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote their great tragedies, that Aristophanes wrote his comedies, that Thucydides and Herodotus wrote their histories. So the 5th century BC was the cultural high point of Athenian civilization. During the 4th century BC, that is the 300s, Greece came under the domination of Macedonia, first by Philip of Macedon, and then by his son Alexander, Alexander the Great, who of course conquered not only Greece, but all of the known world, or at least most of the known world, and died in 323 BC. After Alexander's death in 323, Greek culture entered a phase that scholars call the Hellenistic period. And during this time, the Hellenistic period is usually considered to last from Alexander's death in 323 BC to 31 BC, a date that we will come back to in a later lecture. During this period, the Hellenistic period, Greece was less important politically than it had been. Its political influence on the Mediterranean world was waning, but culturally it was still extremely important and extremely prolific. During the Hellenistic age, Greece produced literature, artwork, scholarship, and so on. And during this same time frame that I've sketched in so quickly here, the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd centuries BC, Rome was growing as an important political player on the Mediterranean scene. So the two cultures naturally came into contact with one another through trade, as well as through visiting, through other forms of contact. But there was another way in which Rome came into contact with Greek culture as Rome was developing back in Italy from its very beginnings. Much of southern Italy had been colonized by Greek settlers between the 8th and 5th centuries BC. These colonists settled various cities along the coastlines of Italy, really from about the area of Naples on southward. Naples, in fact, is a corruption of a Greek word, Neapolis, meaning new city. So Naples itself began as a Greek colony. In fact, the whole area of southern Italy, from Naples southward, was often called Magna Graecia, which means large or great Greece, indicating the importance of these Greek settlements, these Greek colonies in southern Italy. So, as Rome's power spread in Italy, and that was where Rome's power first spread, naturally enough, from the city of Rome itself throughout Italy, as Rome's power spread in Italy, the Romans came into direct contact with Greek culture in these southern Italian cities. From the 4th century BC on, again, as Greece itself is coming under the domination of Philip of Macedon and Alexander, his son, and then is moving into what we call the Hellenistic age, from the 4th century on, Rome is starting to consolidate its power in Italy and to gain control of these Greek cities in the southern part of Italy. Some cities resisted. Some of the Greek colonies resisted Roman domination. Most notably among them, the city of Tarentum in 280 BC enlisted the aid of a Greek king named Pyrrhus from the town Epirus to try to fight the Romans, to try to keep the Romans from gaining control of Tarentum. Pyrrhus won a few victories in which his losses were worse than his enemies' losses, and that's where we get the phrase Pyrrhic victory. And finally, Pyrrhus and the people of Tarentum had to surrender to the Romans in 270 BC. And that's the date at which most scholars say that all of Magna Graecia, all of southern Italy, came under Roman domination. So Rome has control over these Greek cities of southern Italy. It also has interaction with them. People from these newly Romanized Greek cities would move to Rome and bring elements of Greek culture with them. And the interaction of Greek and Roman culture is important. The reason I'm giving you this historical background is because the interaction of Greek culture with Roman culture is so important for our understanding of Roman culture, what it was, and how it worked. Because oddly enough, the Romans simply adapted or took over wholesale a great deal of Greek culture as their own. This is an unusual thing. This does not normally happen, that a culture simply borrows another culture's forms of art, literature, and as we'll see, even to some extent, religious. But this is what the Romans did. They simply took over a great deal of Greek culture, modified it, of course. It would be impossible not to modify it, but modeled their own culture very directly on Greek originals. Roman culture, from the foundation of Rome in the 8th century BC up through this period in the 3rd century when Magna Graecia came under Roman domination, Roman culture had very few indigenous art forms, so far as we can tell. There must have been some. There must have been some native poetry, stories, legends, songs, forms of artwork, all of those things that any culture just seems spontaneously to produce. But very little of that kind of material has survived. One reason for that is that the Romans themselves, later Romans of, say, the 3rd, 2nd, 1st centuries BC, don't seem to have valued their own earliest original artwork or literature or folk tradition very much at all, so it wasn't preserved. They did not place a high value on these indigenous traditions, in other words. Instead of developing their own traditions, what Roman culture did was derive a great deal of its art, philosophy, literature, and so forth, even its religion, directly from Greece. This is most obvious in the visual arts. Roman sculpture, for instance, starts and continues for some time to be pretty much a matter of copying Greek originals. If you go through some of the great art galleries of Europe or this country, you'll very frequently see a statue marked Roman copy of Greek original. And our knowledge of some of the most famous works of Greek art, some of the most famous statues of classical Greek art and Hellenistic Greek art, comes through Roman copies. Frequently, the Roman copy will survive when the Greek original doesn't. So Roman sculpture began as a matter of copying Greek originals. Roman painting was more homegrown, was less a matter of copying Greek originals, but of course less painting has survived. Roman literature, more importantly for our purposes, Roman literature also followed Greek models. Literature arrives relatively late on the Roman scene. Again, Rome was founded in the 8th century BC. The first actual work of literature we know about dates to 240 BC, when a playwright named Livius Andronicus produced a tragedy and a comedy in Rome. He based these two forms of tragedy and comedy directly on the tragedies and comedies of Greece. So what he did was take over two Greek dramatic or literary forms and turn them into Latin. He wrote in Latin, produce them in Rome, bring drama, theater if you like, to Rome. According to ancient biographers, Andronicus himself was half Greek and was from Tarentum, that same city that was the last holdout in Magna Graecia against Roman domination. He supposedly taught Greek and Latin grammar to aristocrats' children in Rome. Epic, Roman epic, begins at about the same time with a translation of Homer's Odyssey into Latin, also by Livius Andronicus. So Livius Andronicus seems to have had some strong interest in bringing Greek literary forms into Latin, introducing Greek literature to Rome. The most important early Roman epic, the most important epic before the Aeneid, was a work called Annales, which just means annals, year-by-year history is what that word literally means, written by a man named Aeneas. Aeneas lived from 239 to 169 BC. He too was from southern Italy, from a town in the heel of the Italian boot, and he too taught Greek and Latin grammar in Rome, just as Andronicus had before him. The Annales were written late in Aeneas's life. We don't know the exact date, and unfortunately the Annales does not survive. It's one of those lost works of antiquity. We have some quotations from it. We know about it. We know a good deal about what its subject matter was, but the work itself has disappeared, has not survived to the modern day. But there are two very important things about Aeneas's Annales for your understanding of the Aeneid. First off, Aeneas used the same poetic meter that Homer uses in the Iliad and Odyssey, dactylic hexameter. Andronicus, when he translated the Odyssey into Latin, had not used the meter of Greek epic. He had used a meter that was more natural to Latin, more workable in the Latin language. Aeneas began the tradition of writing Latin epic in the same poetic meter as Greek epic. And secondly, the other interesting point about Annales is that Aeneas in it presents himself as the reincarnation of Homer, which is a wonderful metaphorical statement about Roman culture taking over, modeling itself on, drawing directly on Greek culture. Aeneas presents himself as literally Homer reborn. Other Greek literary forms that the Romans copied included lyric poetry, that is personal poetry, short, intense personal poems, history, the writing of history in prose form. Both of these came into their own in Roman culture in the 1st century BC, the same time frame in which Virgil is writing the Aeneid. But perhaps the most surprising cultural borrowing of Roman culture from Greek culture is in the realm of religion and mythology. Now, the Romans did have some native homegrown mythology, legends, religious stories, whatever you want to call that category of story. There's no doubt about that. The most obvious and the most famous of their own legends, of course, is the story of Romulus and Remus that we'll talk about in lecture number 2. They did have their own native traditions, their own native stories, and some of those did survive all the way through the period of Roman culture that we're going to be talking about in this course. But when it came to stories about their major gods and goddesses, not about ancient heroes who perhaps had founded the city of Rome, not about local deities, gods and goddesses of individual towns or of individual lakes or whatever, but when it came to their main gods and goddesses, the Romans assimilated their major deities to Greek equivalents and adopted Greek stories about those deities. Let me explain what I mean by assimilated. That's a term that historians of religion often use. The Greeks and the Romans were both polytheistic cultures. That is, they worshipped many, many gods. Now, as Rome developed, it came to worship a main father god, somehow associated with the sky and with weather, whom the Romans called Jupiter. When they come into contact with Greek culture, they discover that the Greeks worship a main father god, somehow associated with the sky and weather, whom they call Zeus. And so the Romans, since they believe that these gods are real, that these gods actually exist, they say, all right, it's got to be the same god. We call him Jupiter, they call him Zeus, it's the same god. Nothing terribly surprising in that. Polytheistic cultures do this sort of thing. The Greeks and the Romans both assumed that the Egyptian god Ammon, or Hammon, for instance, was also the same god as Jupiter, Zeus, whatever other name he may have had elsewhere. And so similarly, the Romans assumed that Jupiter's wife Juno was the same goddess as the Greek goddess Hera, who was married to Zeus, and on through all the major gods and goddesses. What's a little bit surprising is the degree to which the Romans simply took over all the stories that the Greeks told about these gods. In addition to simply saying, we call him Jupiter, the Greeks call him Zeus, the Romans also seem to have been content to say, and the Greeks have all these great stories about him, so we don't need to think up any stories of our own, we'll just take theirs. That is somewhat unusual and somewhat surprising. And that, of course, is why handbooks of mythology so often refer to Greco-Roman mythology. The mythology is really, for the most part, Greek, but often our main knowledge of it comes through Roman versions. This can be perplexing for the student of mythology, believe me. For instance, our knowledge of some of the apparently most important Greek myths or legends comes to us through the Roman author Ovid, who wrote a book called Metamorphoses, which preserves some myths that are not preserved by any other author. Now, with all of this, you would think that the Romans must have absolutely idolized the Greeks to adapt their culture to this extent, and yet it is, as always, not quite that simple. The Romans' attitude towards Greece and Greek culture was surprisingly ambivalent, considering the extent of these cultural borrowings. On the one hand, Romans tended to look up to Greeks as cultural models. I mentioned that Livius Andronicus and Ennius taught Greek and Latin grammar to aristocrats' children. It was a mark of status in Rome to have a Greek tutor, usually a slave, for your children, because Greeks were considered culturally superior. They knew more. They were more polished. They were more sophisticated. So, on the one hand, the Romans looked up to the Greeks as cultural models and quite unabashedly borrowed, as I've developed in this lecture, borrowed many elements of culture from Greece. On the other hand, the Romans also viewed the Greeks with suspicion as decadent, overly fond of luxury, a little bit effeminate, not particularly trustworthy. So at one and the same time, the Romans looked up to the Greeks as cultural models and looked down on them as not being the same strong, masculine, soldierly types that the Romans liked to see themselves as being. This double view of Greece, admiration on the one hand, contempt on the other, to put it perhaps a little too strongly, this double view of Greece was only exacerbated by the Roman conquest of Greece in 146 BC. From 146 BC on, Greece was a Roman province, was under Roman political control, and that really exacerbated both sides of this double view of Greece. From 146 on, more and more Greeks came into Rome, so the cultural aspects of Greece were more evident all the time in Rome. But on the other hand, the Romans had conquered the Greeks, so clearly the Greeks were not the same warlike, rugged, strong people that the Romans themselves were. This ambivalence, I think, continues really throughout Roman culture, this ambivalence towards Greece. So, in this lecture, we've noted the Aeneid's importance and tried to explain part of why it's so important, outlined the format of the course, and begun to set the background for your study of the Aeneid by looking at the interrelation of Greek and Roman culture. In the next lecture, we'll turn to the specific mythological and literary background, Greek and Roman both, of the Aeneid.
Lecture 2, From Aeneas to Romulus.
Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 2. In our first lecture, we looked at the cultural background of the Aeneid, specifically how Roman culture drew on Greek models. In this lecture, we're going to turn to another type of background, the mythological and literary background of the Aeneid. We'll look at how the Aeneid draws on two different sources of mythical background, the Greek-Trojan War story and the Roman story of Rome's foundation by Romulus. We'll discuss how the Aeneid integrates these two strands of legend, and then finally we'll turn to considering some of the literary models that Virgil used to write the Aeneid. Now, Virgil chose to write an epic for Rome that drew upon both Greek and Roman strands of tradition. He cast his epic most obviously in the Greek tradition by setting it in the time frame of the Trojan War, and in fact by using as his main character a character from the Iliad, Aeneas. But he altered many elements of the traditional Greek story, and he brought in many elements of native Roman tradition as well. The Aeneid both owes a great deal to the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and differs from them in many ways, as we'll talk about throughout the entire course of these lectures. Still, the Trojan War story is the primary and most obvious mythic background of the Aeneid. And the Trojan War, as I mentioned already in the first lecture, is the most famous legend in all of ancient literature. It permeates Greek literature, Greek art as well, for that matter. For the Greeks, the Trojan War was the great episode of their mythic past. The most important war fought by mythical heroes. The most important heroes out of mythology are by and large involved with the Trojan War. There are some exceptions, such as Heracles. But also for the Greeks, the Trojan War was seen as the last great episode in mythical time. It is the end of the mythic age and the beginning of the purely human age. After the Trojan War, nothing really much happens in Greek mythology. The heroes fade away. Normal, everyday, regular humans appear on the scene. So the Trojan War for the Greeks is both the culmination of their mythic past and in many ways the most important episode of that mythic past. The main sources of information that we have on this war between a Greek expeditionary force and the people of Troy, which is located in modern-day Turkey, the main sources of information we have on this war are, of course, the Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But it sometimes surprises people who haven't read the Homeric epics to realize how very small a portion of the Trojan War they actually narrate. These two epics do not by any means tell the full story of the Trojan War. The Iliad focuses on events that happened during the last year of the war, during one small interval in the last year of the 10-year war, and the Odyssey deals with Odysseus's further adventures after the war. As I said in the first lecture, the Aeneid, as it happens, is our primary source for the story of the actual fall of Troy, which is alluded to in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but not actually narrated in either of those epics. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey were not the only Greek epics to deal with the Trojan War and its aftermath. There were other epic poems in antiquity that filled in the gaps, so to speak, that told what happened before the Iliad begins, the background to the Trojan War, told what happened during the first 9 years of the war, what happened between the Iliad and the Odyssey, and what happened after the Odyssey. In antiquity itself, as early as the 6th or 5th centuries BC in Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey were already recognized as out and away the two greatest epics, also the longest, the most richly detailed. So when I tell you that the other epics that narrated the events of the Trojan War are lost, that's not a literary catastrophe to the extent that it might seem. It's not as though there were 7 or 8 other Iliads and Odysseys that have disappeared. The other epics were much shorter and, as far as we can tell, of much poorer quality. But for our purposes here, it's important to realize that they did exist, that Virgil had access to a much fuller literary account of the Trojan War through epic than we now. There are also many Greek tragedies from the 5th century BC that dealt with episodes from the Trojan War. Some of the still surviving tragedies show this. For instance, Euripides' Trojan Women, Aeschylus's Oresteia that narrates the aftermath of the war for the family of Agamemnon. Many lost tragedies, many tragedies that no longer exist, also dealt with Trojan War themes. So Virgil could draw upon Greek tragedy to find out information about the Trojan War. And Virgil and his readers had access to other literary sources as well that no longer survive. So when Virgil set out to write the Aeneid, he had a vast body of Greek literary material to draw upon for various episodes in the war and in the events immediately following the war. However, the details of Aeneas's escape from Troy and his subsequent adventures were far from fixed. In the Iliad, Aeneas appears as a character, but he's a fairly minor character, and there's not much detail given about him. This means that Virgil, and for that matter other Roman authors as well before Virgil, had great leeway to mold the story of Aeneas to his own specifications, pretty much to send Aeneas where he wanted him to go on his wanderings, to have Aeneas meet whomever Virgil wanted him to meet, and to mold the story to do what Virgil wanted it to do for the purposes of the Aeneid. The idea that Aeneas was the ancestor of the Roman race has its origins in the Iliad itself, in a scene where Poseidon prophesies that Aeneas will survive the sack of Troy and will found a new city elsewhere. Now, in the Iliad, that's a very vague prophecy. That's about all Poseidon says. He says that Achilles can't kill Aeneas because Aeneas is destined to survive and found another city elsewhere. As early as the 5th century BC, Greek historians had identified Aeneas's new city with Rome, which makes perfect sense from the Greek point of view. We refer to the Trojan War as a myth. The Greeks themselves believed that it had actually happened. Now, obviously, as time went on, many educated Greeks and Romans later probably thought that many of the details Homer gave were incorrect, but the war itself was taken as a fact of history, as something that had actually happened in the remote past. Therefore, when Poseidon says in the Iliad that Aeneas is going to survive and found a city, it's taken as a given that in fact he did. And it makes sense if you are a 5th century Greek historian looking around for a city that might be the one Aeneas founded. This is right when Rome really starts to come into prominence as an up-and-coming player on the Mediterranean scene. That's probably the city Aeneas founded. There's got to be one somewhere, and Rome seems to fit the bill. Various versions about how exactly Rome had come into existence, however, developed as Rome grew in power and importance. The idea that Aeneas was the ultimate ancestor of the Roman race seems to have been pretty well fixed fairly early on. But who exactly founded the city, when exactly they founded it, how many generations they were removed from Aeneas, these details were malleable for rather a surprisingly long time. Now, when Virgil set out to write the Aeneid, he clearly assumes that his audience is very, very familiar with the overall Trojan War story, with the main background legend of the Trojan War, because the Aeneid clearly alludes to all sorts of events and episodes in the Trojan War myth that are not part of its own narrative. It alludes to them but doesn't ever explain them. So at this point, I want to run very quickly through the basic outline of the Trojan War story that Virgil seems to have assumed his audience would know without needing to be told. The first very important event, which is referred to within the first 20 lines of the Aeneid, is the so-called Judgment of Paris. The Judgment of Paris refers to the human Paris, a prince of Troy, having to judge a beauty contest between 3 goddesses. As it happens, at the wedding feast of the mortal man Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, who were the parents of the great hero Achilles, the goddess Eris, goddess of strife, discord, quarrelsomeness, who had not been invited to the wedding feast, threw down a golden apple onto the banquet table to get revenge for not having been invited. She threw down a golden apple which was inscribed, "To the fairest, to the most beautiful." The apple lands on the table, and 3 goddesses, Juno, Minerva, and Venus, stretch out their hands saying, "A present for me, how delightful." Each goddess, in other words, thinks that anything that says "for the most beautiful" is clearly addressed to her. Jupiter is the husband, as well as the brother, of Juno, the father of Minerva, who is his favorite daughter. Minerva, of course, is the equivalent of the Greek Athena, and Jupiter is also the father, at least according to some versions, of Venus, the equivalent of the Greek Aphrodite, who is as the goddess of sexual passion and desire, causes a lot of trouble for Jupiter in various different stories in mythology. So Jupiter does not want to touch this decision with a 10-foot pole. He doesn't want to annoy any one of these 3 goddesses. He does what gods so often do in Greco-Roman mythology. When faced with an awkward situation that could have severe consequences, push it off on a human being. And the human he picks to judge between these 3 goddesses is Paris, a prince of Troy, who at this point happens to be living away from the palace as a shepherd in the countryside. So the 3 goddesses appear in front of Paris, led by the guide and messenger god Mercury, and ask him to judge which of them is the most beautiful. However, they don't rely simply on Paris's judgment or good taste. Each goddess offers him a bribe if he will pick her. Juno offers him domination over many cities, Minerva offers him prowess in battle, and Venus promises him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris picks Venus. By the way, by so doing, he's acting in direct opposition to what a Homeric hero ought to do. He is judging that sexual pleasure is more important than either political power or power on the battlefield. But that's what he does. He picks Venus, who promises him the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, immediately there's a problem because, as everyone knows, the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Jupiter and a human mother, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. In other words, Helen is already married, but Venus has just promised Helen to Paris as his wife if Paris will pick her as the most beautiful of the goddesses. The fact that Helen is already married doesn't stop Venus or Paris for a moment. Paris goes to visit Helen and Menelaus in Sparta, and once there, either seduces or abducts Helen, depending on which author you ask, but the upshot is the same. He runs away with her, whether she's a willing or unwilling accomplice. The Greeks are not going to let that pass. Under the leadership of Menelaus's elder brother Agamemnon, the Greeks muster an army and go to Troy and fight for Helen's return. So Agamemnon is Menelaus's older brother, Helen's brother-in-law. He leads the expedition. This war lasts for 10 years. In the final year of the war, the preeminent Trojan warrior Hector is killed by the preeminent Greek warrior Achilles, who is himself killed, shot by an arrow fired by Paris shortly after the death of Hector. Now, remember, I'm going through the outline of what Virgil would expect his readers to know about the Trojan War. Aeneas, who is a cousin of Hector, a minor member of the Trojan royal family, that is, fought on the Trojan side. Aeneas is the son of the Trojan man Anchises and the goddess Venus. Venus is Aeneas's mother. So Aeneas is a warrior on the Trojan side. After Achilles' death, the Greeks resort to trickery to win the war. The sides are about evenly balanced. Hector is dead, Achilles is dead, the war's already gone on for 10 years. They resort to trickery in order to win the war, using the famous ruse of the Trojan horse, invented by Ulysses. That's the Latin name for the hero the Greeks called Odysseus. The Greeks manage to get access to the city of Troy and to sack it and destroy it by night. And we'll talk about the Trojan horse and the sack of Troy in more detail in Lecture 5. The traditional date of the sack of Troy, by the way, is 1184 BC. That's the year in which Greek historians thought that the sack of Troy happened. Now, Aeneas managed to escape. As I already said, it's prophesied in the Iliad by Poseidon that he will escape. He manages to escape the sack of Troy, taking his son Ascanius, who's also called Iülus. The child has two names. Ascanius and Iülus are the same boy. Taking Ascanius and his old father Anchises with him, Aeneas escapes the sack of Troy. He reaches Italy, marries the Italian princess Lavinia, and founds a city called His son, either Ascanius or another son born to Aeneas and Lavinia, depending on which version of the legend you follow, Aeneas' son founds a city called Alba Longa. So that's the basic background that Virgil draws upon for the Trojan War itself and the aftermath of the Trojan War. But this Greek story, this myth of the Trojan War, was not the only myth that the Romans had about the origins of Rome and the Roman people. Within their own native tradition, they had, as I mentioned in the last lecture, legends about the founding of the city of Rome itself by Romulus. Romulus and his twin brother Remus were the grandsons of a king of Alba Longa many, many generations after its foundation by Ascanius or a brother of Ascanius. They were the grandsons of the king of Alba Longa, born to the king's daughter Rhea Silvia and the god Mars. Rhea Silvia was raped by the god Mars, became pregnant with twins, gave birth to Romulus and Remus. At birth, these boys were set adrift in a basket on the Tiber River, the river that flows through Rome, by their wicked, usurping great uncle, because despite the fact that they were illegitimate and despite the fact that they were the sons of the king's daughter, not his son, their great uncle still feared that they might grow up to take the kingship, so he tried to kill them. He set them adrift in a basket on the Tiber River. As so often happens in this sort of myth of a hero's childhood, the basket washed ashore and the boys were rescued by a she-wolf, a female wolf, who had a litter of puppies, recognized these boys as puppies of a different species, took them in and suckled them. And of course, this is the origin of the very famous emblem of Rome, the she-wolf as an emblem of Rome. At some point after the she-wolf rescued the boys, they were found and adopted by a shepherd who, with his wife, raised them as his own sons. Now, after Romulus and Remus reached adulthood, again, this is a very common theme in myths of a hero's childhood, they were recognized, their true lineage was discovered through a series of coincidences and unlikely circumstances. They restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa and decided to found a new city of their